The hospital corridor was still quiet when Bryce Strand walked out of Camille's room, carrying the gray diaper bag. The one she had packed herself, the one with the extra onesies, and the printed intake form from the pediatrician's office. Camille noticed the bag before she noticed the absence of his voice. She had been half asleep, still tender from the epidural, watching the window fill with early gray light. Ivy was curled in the bassinet 3 feet away, breathing the way only newborns breathe, in small, perfect intervals that made every parent stop and stare, just to be sure. The door clicked shut. She heard the elevator at the end of the hall open, then close. She called Bryce's name once. No one answered. The night nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Kim, came in 20 minutes later and found Camille sitting up with the IV still in her arm, trying to reach Bryce on a phone with 11% battery. The call went to voicemail. Then again. Then again. "Is there someone I should call for you?" Kim asked. Camille looked at the bassinet. Ivy's tiny fist had risen near her chin in sleep. The room smelled of antiseptic and the white lilies Bryce had brought on the day of the birth, 2 days ago. The lilies were already beginning to brown at the edges. "No," Camille said, though it wasn't true. What was true was this. The gray diaper bag was gone. The printed insurance summary clipped to the outside pocket was also gone, along with the manila envelope Bryce had placed on the bedside table the evening before, asking her to sign the documents inside. He had described them as annual trust review forms. She had been 3 hours out of labor. She had signed without reading. She had done that before, many times, because Bryce had always described her father's trust as a formality, an empty structure that hadn't held real value since her father sold the design firm 8 years ago. Camille had believed him. She had believed him for 6 years of marriage. Through the miscarriage, through the late nights, Bryce worked alongside his project director Fiona Bassett, through the way Fiona's name appeared in his texts, with an ease that felt practiced rather than professional. Now she sat in a hospital bed, 48 hours after delivering her daughter, holding a phone with a dying battery, and understood that she had been believed into a corner. The text arrived at 7:14 a.m. "I need some time. Fiona and I are heading to Boulder to handle the Meridian project. I've arranged for your mother to come get you. Don't make this complicated." Camille's mother lived in Phoenix. They had not spoken since the previous Christmas. She took a screenshot. She turned the phone off. The man who entered her room at 9:30 a.m. was not a doctor and not a hospital administrator. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal overcoat that was wrong for the season, but entirely right for his presence. He had the kind of stillness that made the machines in the room seem louder by contrast. "Mrs. Strand," he said from the doorway. "My name is Aldous Mercer. I knew your father." Camille had heard the name. Her father had mentioned it once, years before his death. A man who had worked alongside him during the early years of the design practice, who had left to manage a private investment group. She remembered the name because her father had used it, the way people use the names of people they trust completely, without explanation. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because your father asked me to come if the morning ever looked like this one." She looked at Ivy in the bassinet. "He's been dead 4 years. He made the arrangements before he died." Aldous stepped inside and closed the door behind him. A woman in a dark blazer waited in the corridor. He told Camille there was a car downstairs whenever she was ready to be discharged. There was a house available, stocked, safe, an hour outside the city, that her father had placed in a family LLC specifically for her use. There was a pediatric nurse waiting there named Joanna, if she wanted help with Ivy. He told her none of this urgently. He spoke the way people speak when they have prepared for a long time and are finally allowed to act. "The documents Bryce had you sign last night," Aldous said. "What did they look like?" "Pages. I don't know. He said it was trust housekeeping." Aldous nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "We'll need you to describe them to a lawyer. Everything you remember. The time, the light in the room, how he explained them." Camille looked at him. "Was I signing away something real?" He did not soften the answer. "Possibly the most valuable thing your father left you." She was discharged by noon. The hospital discharge nurse offered a wheelchair. Camille walked. She carried Ivy in the borrowed infant carrier, the maternity ward kept for exactly this kind of situation. A mother leaving without the bag that was supposed to hold the carrier she'd brought from home. Aldous' assistant held the door. The house sat at the edge of a property with a long gravel driveway and a view of the foothills, and it smelled of clean wood and cedar. The crib in the front bedroom was already assembled. A basket on the changing table held diapers, wipes, formula, and 3 newborn sleepers in the right size. Camille stood in the doorway and did not speak for a while. "How did you know the size?" she finally asked. "Your father's file included your due date. We estimated." The word "we" sat with her. There had been a "we" preparing for this, for the specific morning when Bryce Strand would walk out of a hospital room, and she had known none of it. Joanna introduced herself quietly, asked about Ivy's last feeding, and took over without requesting anything in return. Aldous gave Camille 30 minutes to eat a bowl of soup someone had left warm on the stove, and then he sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her the truth about her father's estate. Edmund Norris had not simply sold his architectural design firm. He had sold the operating company, the staff, the client relationships, the brand. What he had not sold, what he had specifically, legally, deliberately retained, were the design patents, 11 of them, filed over 18 years of practice, covering proprietary structural systems used in modular building construction. Those patents had been placed in a family trust. Camille was the sole beneficiary. Bryce had known about the patents since before the wedding. He had told Camille they were lapsed, expired, worthless. Litigation risk, he'd said, not assets. He had shown her statements. He had shown her letters from attorneys. He had shown her. Camille now understood exactly what he had decided she should see. In reality, Bryce's firm, Strand and Bassett Design Group, had licensed 3 of those patents through a shell company to win federal construction contracts worth nearly $30 million over the past 5 years. The patents were not lapsed. They were the foundation of everything Bryce had built. He used them, Camille asked. He licensed them through a company called Norris Design Consulting. The name was your father's. The ownership was a holding company Bryce controlled through Fiona Bassett's brother. Camille set down her spoon. The soup had gone cold. "The documents I signed last night." Aldous opened the folder he had brought to the table. "If the signatures are valid, they transfer your beneficial interest in the trust. The notarization is questionable." He used a mobile notary with a documented history of expedited signings for the firm. "I was 48 hours post-delivery." "Yes, that will matter." She looked at him for a long time. "You've been waiting to tell me this." "I've been waiting to tell you this safely." He held her gaze. "Your father understood that knowledge given too early, without protection around it, becomes a weapon someone else can use against you. He wanted you to have it when you had somewhere solid to stand." Camille thought about all the dinners where Bryce had spoken about her father's company as a burden he'd helped her escape. The conversations where he had redirected her questions about the trust with the patience of a man who expected not to be challenged, the way he had always been the one to handle the paperwork. Her hands had stopped shaking without her noticing. "What do I do?" she asked. "You decide all of it. I can only open the door." She called the family lawyer the next morning. Not Bryce's lawyer, but her father's, a woman named Gail Tanner, whom Aldous had kept in contact with the trust since Edmund's death. Gail appeared on a video call with the expression of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 4 years. "The transfer documents Bryce had you sign are voidable," Gail said. "Duress, incapacity, potentially fraud. We'll need the originals and the notary's records." "He has the originals." "Copies were filed with the trust." He didn't know that. Bryce called 3 times on the 2nd day. Camille let the calls ring. On the 4th, she answered without speaking first. "Where are you?" His voice was controlled in the way it always was when he was actually afraid. "Somewhere safe. You need to come home. Ivy needs her own space, her own things. You're not thinking clearly. What happened to you was traumatic. You left me in a hospital bed 48 hours after I gave birth." I explained. "You sent a text. You said you were going to Boulder with Fiona." A pause. "Fiona and I have a project deadline." "Is the baby yours, Bryce?" Silence that lasted 3 full seconds. "That's not. You're being." "It's a direct question. I'm going to get an emergency hearing. You cannot take Ivy out of state without my consent." "I haven't left the state." Camille kept her voice even. "Don't call again unless it's about Ivy's care. When it is, I'll answer." She ended the call and handed the phone to Gail, who had been listening on speaker. He'll file in the next 48 hours, Gail said. Let him. What Bryce filed claimed that Camille had left the family home in a postpartum crisis, taken the infant to an undisclosed location with an unknown man, and refused to communicate. His attorney attached a statement from a hospital employee who described Camille as visibly distressed on the morning of her discharge. What Gail filed in response included the discharge summary, showing Camille had left of her own accord in stable condition, the text message from Bryce indicating he had made no arrangements for his wife or newborn, and a sworn statement from Kim, the night nurse, who remembered very clearly that Bryce Strand had left the maternity ward at approximately 7:04 a.m. without speaking to the nursing staff or making any plan for the infant's transport. The judge denied Bryce's emergency motion. The patent board convened at the end of that week in a building Camille had never visited, a suite that still bore the faint grid marks from her father's old drafting tables. She came with Ivy in the carrier and sat across from Gail, and for the first time since the hospital, she felt the specific weight of understanding what she actually owned. The patents were generating royalties. Quietly, steadily through Bryce's shell company, they had been generating royalties for years, deposited into accounts that flowed back to him. The trust's independent accountant had traced nearly $2 million. He told me the trust was a liability, Camille said. He told you that because the truth would have given you options. Gail laid the statements on the table. You had options this entire marriage. He knew it. He made sure you didn't. Camille looked at the figures. Then she picked up the phone and called Aldous. How quickly can we convene the patent board? She asked. By end of week, if you want it. I want it. Bryce appeared at the firm's emergency board meeting, with 2 attorneys and Fiona Bassett at his side. Fiona wore a structured blazer and the expression of a woman who had decided she was about to inherit something. Eunice Strand, Bryce's mother, sat in the back row with her hands folded and her eyes moving between her son and the door. Camille joined remotely. She sat at a clean desk in the trust's office with Ivy sleeping beside her and Gail at her right. The video screen made her appear farther away than she was. The trust's independent attorney opened with the patent documentation. 11 registered patents, active, valid, licensed without the beneficiary's knowledge, through a third-party company controlled by Fiona's family. The licensing agreements bore a signature purporting to be the trust administrator's, a position that had been vacant since Edmund Norris's death. Bryce said. Camille agreed to the use of her father's intellectual property. We discussed it. The attorney asked for documentation of that agreement. Bryce looked at his lawyer. There was no documentation. Fiona's attorney intervened to note that his client had acted in good faith, based on representations made by Bryce Strand. That she had been told the patents were available. That she had a written communication from Bryce explicitly stating the trust had been restructured to allow the licensing. Bryce turned toward Fiona. Fiona did not look at him. Her attorney placed a copy of that communication on the table. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something cannot be undone. Camille spoke once during the meeting. She waited until Bryce had finished claiming the patent documentation was ambiguous and that its applicability to federal contracts had never been confirmed. The federal contracts specify the structural systems by patent number, Camille said. Those numbers belong to my father's trust. They are not ambiguous. They are specific. The firm used them. The firm profited. The question before this board is what happens now. Eunice stood from the back row. My son built this firm from. He built this firm with leverage he borrowed without disclosing its source, Camille said. The board can decide what that means. The board voted to suspend Bryce from executive authority pending an independent audit. Fiona's employment was terminated for cause. The licensing agreements were voided. It was not the ending. It was the beginning of a process that would take months. But it was the first moment that Bryce Strand looked across a room and could not explain his way out of what he had done. What Bryce released publicly afterward was a statement accusing Camille of exploiting postpartum instability to seize the firm's intellectual assets. He said she had been manipulated by a man with a personal financial interest in destabilizing his company. He said she needed to come home. Camille's response went out through Gail the following morning. 4 sentences. Mrs. Strand left a hospital where she had been abandoned without transportation or arrangements of any kind 48 hours after giving birth. She is cooperating fully with the court and the patent review process. Her daughter is healthy. She has no further comment on her husband's public characterizations. It did not argue. It did not explain. It made Bryce's version sound like what it was. The civil case produced figures that landed with the particular force of things that had always been true and had simply been kept out of reach. The patent royalties diverted through Norris Design Consulting totaled more than $2.5 million over 5 years. A separate account held an additional $600,000 in deferred licensing fees, never disclosed to the trust. Fiona cooperated with the investigation after Bryce indicated to his attorney that she had arranged the licensing independently. She provided emails. She provided the message thread in which Bryce had explicitly instructed her to include the Norris Trust's patent numbers in the federal bid documents, without mentioning the trust by name. She also provided the message in which Bryce had written, 4 months before Ivy was born. By the time she's managing a newborn, she won't have the bandwidth to look into any of this. Camille read that sentence in Gail's office, with Ivy asleep in the carrier against her chest. She didn't cry. She had expected cruelty. She had not expected to see it stated so plainly, in his own words, in the offhand tone of a man who had measured her attention and decided it was safe to take from her. He bet on exhaustion, Gail said. He bet wrong, Camille said. She authorized the civil claim. She did not authorize the dramatic press release Aldis's team had drafted. She rewrote it herself. 3 paragraphs. What the patents were, how they had been used without authorization, what the trust intended to recover. She did not use the word stolen. She used the words unlicensed and misrepresented, and without disclosure. She let the facts do what dramatic language never could. Make it impossible to argue Bryce had simply made a mistake. Bryce was charged with 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of falsifying a legal instrument, and 1 count of misappropriation of trust property. He negotiated a plea the morning. The federal contractors, notified that the patents underlying their building systems had been improperly licensed, indicated they intended to pursue indemnification from his firm. He served 9 months and was barred from serving as a licensed architect or firm officer for 7 years. Fiona received a lesser charge, a fine and professional censure. The board paid legally required parental benefits, then pursued recovery of company funds she had knowingly received. What her cooperation had purchased was not innocence. It had purchased a proportional consequence, which was different. The firm itself dissolved within 2 months of the board vote. Its federal contracts were suspended. The key staff left. The patents returned to the trust. Camille chose not to restart the firm. She chose to license the patents through a properly structured agreement with 3 independent architectural groups, generating income that belonged, cleanly and entirely, to her and to Ivy. Aldis attended the first licensing signing, but did not sit at the table. He stood near the window in the same charcoal overcoat and watched Camille put her name on a document she had read herself, in full, in natural light, with her daughter in a carrier on her chest. Your father would have liked this room, he said afterward. Camille looked at the foothills through the glass. He chose it. He chose a lot of things for you. The rest you chose yourself. That distinction stayed with her. She moved into the family property permanently, not because it was grander than anything she had shared with Bryce, but because the locks were hers, and the address was not in any court filing with his name on it. She changed the gate code every month. She kept Ivy's schedule consistent. She answered Bryce's calls during court-approved hours, and documented every conversation. He did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer it. What she offered instead, in the slow architecture of the months that followed, was the more difficult thing. A custody arrangement that let Ivy know her father. With supervision, with a parenting coordinator, without using the child as a ledger for adult injury. The coordinator described Camille as the most disciplined co-parent she had managed in 11 years of practice. Camille considered that less a compliment than a measure of how much she had learned to separate what she felt from what Ivy needed. The girl grew. She had Camille's eyes and her grandfather's hands, already reaching for edges and corners, already interested in the shape of things. Aldis came to the house one evening in late fall, when Ivy was almost 8 months old. He brought lemons from a tree on his property. Specific, unheroic, the gift of a man who didn't know what else to bring and chose something useful instead. They sat on the porch after Ivy was asleep, and the foothills went dark against a low sky. You never told me what this cost you, Camille said. All of it, the years of waiting. Your father paid those costs. You paid them too. He was quiet for a moment. He was the first person who ever trusted me with something important and didn't ask for it back. That's worth a considerable amount of your own time. Camille thought about the different shapes trust could take. The shape of a man who trusted his partner so completely, he built a system to protect her after his death. The shape of a man who understood that trust given to the wrong person could hollow a life from the inside. The shape of her own hand, signing a document in a dim hospital room, believing that love made verification unnecessary. She did not believe that anymore. She believed in the archive, in the copies kept in 3 separate places, in the name, on the account and the expiration date on the patent, and the clause in the agreement that specified who could authorize a transfer and who could not. She believed that tenderness without documentation was a gift someone else could take. She also believed, more slowly, more carefully, that help could be offered without a price attached, that Aldous had spent 4 years ready to open a door and had still waited for her to choose to walk through it, that Gail had explained every option without making a single decision for her, that even Joanna, who had cared for Ivy through those first raw weeks, had handed the baby back each time without making Camille feel she had needed to ask. She was learning the difference between people who offered help and people who offered help in exchange for authority over your own life. Bryce had offered the latter for 6 years and called it partnership. On the night Ivy turned 1, there were no photographers and no speeches. Camille's mother had flown in from Phoenix. They were rebuilding that too, carefully, with the methodology Camille now applied to everything. Slowly, with attention to good behavior on both sides, with the freedom to stop if it stopped being safe. Aldous sat at the far end of the porch and let the evening belong to someone else. Ivy sat in the grass with a wooden puzzle and the particular concentration of a child who does not yet know that the world will eventually ask her to pretend to know less than she does. Camille watched her daughter and thought about the morning in the hospital, the click of the door, the gray bag, the 11% battery. She thought about what it had cost and what it had taught her, which were not the same things. She had not been saved because Aldous Mercer had arrived in a charcoal overcoat. She had been saved because she had stopped in a fluorescent hospital room with a dying phone and made a record of what happened before she let herself feel the full weight of it. Everything that followed had been built on that single, clear choice: to document before she grieved, to preserve before she forgave, to understand what she owned before anyone else could tell her it was nothing. Ivy placed the last piece of the puzzle and looked up at her mother with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something real. Camille smiled. That's exactly it, she thought. You find out where the pieces belong. You don't let anyone tell you the puzzle is empty when you can see the pieces right in front of you. And when someone tries to walk away with the box, you remember that you were there, you were paying attention, and the shape of the whole belongs to you. You carry that knowledge carefully. You teach it forward. And you never, not once, mistake a closed door for the end of the world.